I did it. I finally did it. The deed for the land I bought today. I bought my own property. It's mine. It's really mine. My name, Biddy Mason. Biddy, as they call me. Took a while, but it's mine. It's really mine. Something I can call my own and give to my children, my babies, and their babies. Something that nobody can take away from me. A place for the family to grow up in, for us all to feel safe. I can't wait to put a house there with a big porch like the ones on the south. And that was the only way we could escape those humid summer nights in Mississippi. The white families and us, they're people. Being a slave, you worked day and night, and you did whatever the family told you to do. Mostly it was the children. And yes, indeed, the children. Miss Rebecca's brother sent me to help her take care of her 4 little ones. She had another one on the way, too. I almost had no time to take care of my own babies, my Ellen and my Ann. They were but 7 and 3 years old back then. They had to help take care of Miss Rebecca's children, too. Back then, the rich white folk, they bought slaves about the same age as their children and to help and have them grow up together. That was a high status for slaves back then, but sometimes we still felt like we were pets. Miss Rebecca, she was well off in South Carolina. She had a body servant of her own named Hannah. But here in Mississippi, they were poor. Miss Rebecca missed Hannah. Her company mostly. Guess that's why when her father died, they bought Hannah and her 3 children. They came to live with us about a year after I got there. And that Master Robert, he was a piece of work. He always had some plan to make things better, but usually they got worse. He joined up there with the Mormon church, and then a year after told us we were going to move to their homeland in Utah. We had to cross Texas and the Rocky Mountains to Salt Lake City. They packed up their wagons, but us slaves, we had to walk the whole 2,000 miles. Driving their cattle and making camp for them wherever they chose to settle. But we had to find a place outside wherever we could. And sometimes Master Robert came and slept with me. We were there for a few years before Master Robert came up with yet another plan to join up with the Mormons and go to start a new colony in South Carolina. Oh, no, it was Southern California, and California had just become a state. We had to cross that awful desert in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and boy, were we tired. But then we looked up and we saw that beautiful valley where they planned to settle. And we built forts and farmlands, and eventually it became a nice town. Master Robert was raising cattle, and I thought we would have a nice home there for a while, but then something happened. And Master Robert was all bent out of shape, and then he came in one day and said that we were moving back to Texas. And when you're a slave, you do whatever the family tells you to do. Except we weren't slaves anymore. It was illegal to be a slave in Southern California. We found that out, me and my Ellen, from some of the other slaves. But what could we do? We had nowhere to live and no money to live on. And that Master Robert knew that too. He started hiding from the Mormons and the law. And then he moved us about 100 miles into a canyon outside of Los Angeles. He hid us there until he could find supplies for the trip. He took my Ellen with him that day to Mr. Robert Owen's livery stable. While he was haggling over the mules, my Ellen was talking up with Mr. Owen's son, Charles, who worked there. And Charles was the one who told us that we were not slaves anymore. And he also told us what it meant if Master Robert took us back to that slave state of Texas. When they left the livery stable, Charles told his father about what he planned to do, and the next thing I know is the morning before we were supposed to leave to go to Texas, some people from the sheriff's came and they served Master Robert some legal papers. They took me and my children and Hannah and her children to the jail in Los Angeles. Mr. Owens and his son Charles were a part of that, and Charles told Ellen everything would be okay, but Lord, were we scared. After a few days, we went into the courthouse and where Mrs. Rebecca and Master Robert were, and he told them he owned us and that we had willingly left Mississippi to come to Southern California, and that he supported us, and that he treated us like family and had no control over us more than over his own children. You should have heard that. Planned to take us back to Texas, and he said that Hannah and her children were pleased to go. And I guess the judge didn't know him well enough to know what that tone of voice meant, but we did. And poor Hannah, she was in a pickle. She was about to have her baby little Henry any day now. I guess that's why the judge, he let her go back to the camp where Master Robert and Miss Rebecca were, and her boy Lawrence too. He told Master Robert to get a lawyer. And then he took us back to the jailhouse, and we was there for about 2 weeks until the trial started. And when we got to the courthouse, it was packed. I had a lawyer the first day, but he quit the second day. Said that he was being threatened for representing us. A black person wasn't allowed to testify against a white person, and so I couldn't speak for myself, and now I had nobody to speak for me. But that Judge Hayes, he figured it all out. He had me, my Ellen, and my Ann come into his chambers, and he asked us our side of the story, and then he asked us if we knew what it meant to go back to Texas, and he said that the children who were minors would be required to stay here in Southern California, and he asked if I still wanted to go, and I said, no, sir. I would not like to be separated from my children. He asked my Ellen and Ann the same thing, and they said the same, that we would like to stay together. After a few days, we all heard what the judge said, that we, persons of color, cannot be held in slavery or involuntary servitude, and that we were free forever. Forever. He also told Master Robert some things that I never thought anybody would tell him, but they were true. And then we were free. And that good Winnie and Mr. Owens invited us, all of us, to their house in Los Angeles. But what were we to do now? But the Lord did not forget us, and he immediately opened doors for us. Mr. Owens had a neighbor, Dr. Griffin, and he heard about my experience delivering babies, and he offered me a job. And I said, yes, sir. Being a laborer, you only earned $1 a day back then, but Mr. Griffin was offering me $2.50 a day to do what the good Lord gave me. I've been working for Dr. Griffin for about 10 years now. 10 years. Catching babies and nursing for folk all over town, the rich Americans and the poor Californians and some Indians too. He takes me to the jailhouse to help out folk there too, the same jailhouse we were in for 2 weeks. Dr. Griffin is a good man, a kind man, under all that bluster. We've seen a lot of change here in Los Angeles in the last 10 years. They're building on the south side, the American part of town, and they opened up 3 hotels. Most of the people who stay in those hotels are from other parts of the U.S., and they're coming to buy land here in Los Angeles. And they keep Mr. Robbins Owens' livery stable real busy, but not busier than during the Civil War, when the Union camps and the barracks were being built here in Los Angeles. And Dr. Owens, he knew it was a lot of work, but he was determined to keep the business a success. I wish he were here to see this day. God bless his soul. Charles owns that business now. Charles married my Ellen about 2 years after we got our freedom. And they both gave me the best advice. Save money so that you can buy property like they were doing. And that's exactly what I did. I made sure my family had food to eat and a nice bed to lay their heads on and a place with a roof over their head. I rented this here cottage on 1st Street. But everything else, I saved. Until today. I can't even read what's on it, but I know that this piece of paper is worth so much. The best $250 I ever spent. Listen to me sounding like Dr. Griffin and Mr. Owens. But it's true. I'm the first black woman in Los Angeles to own property. How am I the first to do anything? I'll never sell this one. No, this one's mine. Those 10 years were hard, but not as hard as being a slave and working for nothing. Now a reward at the end. I'm so happy. Mama, if you're watching, I hope you're proud. They used to say slaves couldn't get nothing because we couldn't read or write. But now I got something I can call my own. Mama and Papa, whoever you were, I wish y'all was here to see this day. Free's good. I got a place I can give to my children so they can give to their children and their grandchildren that nobody can manipulate. And most importantly, a place for them to feel safe. A place where they can talk how they want and be who they want. And so they don't have to sleep on the ground with nothing to cover their head but the sky. That's all I wanted. That's how I used to live. But I'm thankful for my blessings. The open hand is blessed. That gives in abundance as it receives. That's what I live by. The Owens, they helped us when we were in peril, and that's what I plan to do with my community. The black community here is getting bigger. There's about 60 of us now, and we come here to my place for prayer. We hope to get a church one day, God willing. and with hard work. Yes, hard work. I worked hard, and now I got me a stake in Los Angeles. It's the first step, and there's many more to come, but now I got a path. This is going to be a great day. Oh, Miss Chapman. She said she's not due for another few weeks, but I think she's due to have her baby any day now. I'll go check in on her.
Well, we have with us on stage today Jacqueline Broxton. Jackie is one of the co-founders of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation, which benefits children in foster care and is part of the outreach ministry for the First AME Church. As we know, Biddy Mason from Michelle's performance was one of the co-founders of the First AME Church. And to me, it's really a gift to have you here. We're obviously filming this after the original performance. The students have left the room. It's just the three of us. But what a gift for us, because you really are an embodiment of Biddy's vision and her efforts. 140 years ago, this woman lived and died, and yet her legacy is still reverberating throughout our community, which is incredible. So thank you for coming up. You came up from Los Angeles,
Thank you for
which we
having
really
me.
appreciate. And we have Michelle Hester here, also known as Biddy Mason.
Yes.
Michelle is a UC Santa Barbara senior. She's a very busy young woman. She's majoring in theater with an emphasis in community, and she's also getting her minor in English. And I will tell you that Michelle pulled off this performance during a week when she had another major performance, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute, as well as a very rigorous academic schedule. So she made it look easy. She made it look seamless. I can tell you she put a lot of work into that, into making that performance look easy.
Thank
so
you.
we appreciate that, Michelle. You did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
So Jackie, I just want to start by sort of calling back a little bit to some of the things Michelle told us in her performance. And then I'd just love to hear some of your thoughts on some of these aspects of Biddy's personality. So in 1848, she arrives in what we now know as Salt Lake City, and she came from Mississippi. And she didn't fly Delta, right?
No.
She walked 2,000 miles,
Right.
which in and of itself over a 2-year period would be arduous. But she didn't just walk 2,000 miles over 2 years. She took care of her 3 children. She had an infant, a 4-year-old, and a 10-year-old. She also took care of other people's children, and then she had to cook and midwife and herd the livestock and do all of these things, which, you know, if I have 3 things on my to-do list in a day, I get upset about it, right? But she was constantly multitasking for years. What does that say to you about her personality, her grit, and how that served her, how that experience served her later in her life?
Well, for me, personally, it says a couple of things. Number one, as a mother, her concern was probably her children first.
Right.
I mean, she's got these 3 little girls. She wants to be able to give them a better life than she had, but she's probably not sure what that's going to be given the time. It was not uncommon, you know, you hear these stories about the pioneers. It was not uncommon for people to have these arduous journeys. But I think to be a black woman in that time frame, to have to leave Mississippi and go someplace where you don't know where you're going, you don't know what to expect, it had to be terrifying. So I think the thing that always stands out to me is her determination. Regardless of what happened, she was going to make it work for her family.
Yeah, it's kind of putting that one foot before the other, not mindlessly and fatalistically, but saying, listen, I don't know about tomorrow, but I know about today.
These are the cards I've been dealt,
Right.
and I've got to work
I'm going to
with
play
them.
the best hand I can play with those cards. I totally agree with you. So just continuing on with her story, so in 1851, Robert Smith, who was the person that held her in bondage, he decided to move to California. But it wasn't until 1856, when Smith tried to leave California, that was really, in a way, Biddy's big break.
Yeah.
I hate to think about it, but she probably would have remained in servitude if he hadn't kind of panicked a little bit. And so it was about a 5-year period where she was living in a free state, yet was still in servitude. And then she challenged Mr. Smith in court. Now this is something I find very fascinating, and I'm not an expert in, so correct me when I misspeak. But what I found fascinating was Biddy earned her freedom in California 13 months before the Dred Scott case.
Right.
And we all know what happened to poor old Mr. Dred Scott. And what I also learned was other African Americans in California after Biddy sought their freedom through the courts and were denied it. So when you think about, it's easy to we like to turn people into heroes in this country, and there's nothing wrong with it because it's inspiring and it gives people a North Star to look to. But when you think about it, I don't know that Biddy would have thought of herself as a hero at that point. They're living under this very threatening time. There was this latent threat. You didn't know who was going to knock on your door and tell you, guess what? You're not a free person. What do you think how do you think that uncertainty sort of drove the decisions African Americans in Los Angeles might have made at that time, or just how did it taint their whole view of their universe?
Well, I think the one thing that people tend to overlook with this story of her pursuing her freedom is the love story between her daughter and Robert Owens. I mean, I have a daughter. If she tells me she's in love with someone and she wants to be with that person, if I think that person is good for her, I'm going to move heaven and earth to make it happen.
Right.
So I think that gave her an edge that maybe other people didn't have, and the prominence of the Owens family, and Judge Hayes himself, and how he looked at all of this. So she had a number of things working in her favor that other people may not have had at that time.
I read a little bit about Judge Hayes, and again, I'm not an expert on him, but we do know that, as Biddy said in her performance, her first lawyer quit because of a death threat. So I have to imagine the judge had his share of death threats too.
Yeah, and he wasn't happy about that from what I've read.
Right.
So
right. He's like, not in my court. Right. I'm sure he felt very offended by that. And obviously he had a heart for Biddy and her family. You can imagine the pressure on him to just go with the status quo and just say, yeah, sure, court dismissed. Yeah. And for him to actually say, no, she's free and her family's free, and leave her alone, basically. Had to be a pretty bold move on his part. It's just a shame it didn't translate into other...
I've thought a lot about Judge Hayes, and from what I've read, he seemed to be his own thinker. And then, Dr. Griffin was his relative. I think he was the brother of his wife. Yeah. So he had internal support. But I think more than anything, he wanted to chart his own course.
Okay.
So he may not have been as influenced by what other people thought as we might at first be led to believe. Yeah.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about the doctor. Michelle mentioned the doctor and her performance, but we'll reference back to him in a minute. Interesting. It's a lot of dynamics, certainly a lot of uncertainty for the folks in that time period. We talk about anxiety being an issue today. Can you imagine anxiety back then? Are you kidding?
You don't know where you're going to be.
No, literally, you don't know where you're going to be. So, Michelle, I want to ask you a question about your performance. As I referenced, you had a very busy week. The week that we shot that a couple weeks before this conversation. You had just portrayed a 13-year-old boy in The Watsons Go to Birmingham, and I had the privilege to get to see you in that performance, and to see you go from the 13-year-old boy, which you nailed. My wife was like, "That's Michelle." Yes, that's Michelle. You'll see her later, but she plays an elderly woman. You did a really fantastic job.
Thank you.
And I think I saw you on a Sunday, and we filmed your performance of Biddy on a Thursday. So you did not have a lot of time to prepare. So how did you, what was your process as an actress to do the 13-year-old, to portray a 13-year-old boy knowing that you're going to be portraying a middle-aged woman? How did you make that work?
It's helpful to kind of take them step by step and one at a time and kind of separate them. They are both acting characters and acting jobs that I did have to do, but it was helpful for me to kind of put them in two different headspaces. And so after Sunday was done, that was our closing show, and after that show ended, now it was time for me to, I was focusing on Biddy, especially during rehearsals while I was also performing with also being Byron, but as soon as the closing show was over, I kind of got the opportunity to kind of just use those 3 days before the performance to kind of just deepen the character work for Biddy and kind of figure out who she was and how I meshed with her. And so that was really exciting. I've had a couple other times where there are, in classrooms, we have two different theater classes, and you have one character in this class, one character in this class, and those classes could be back to back. And so just kind of making sure you separate it and leave the other character on the side until you're done with that first one is kind of really helpful, because then it allows you to really use everything you have for each character.
But it's interesting to hear you say you sort of kept the other one in the back of your
Yeah.
head. Like you didn't completely ignore.
No, you can't completely ignore it, because then you use all the work that you built up for that you already have. And so I had to keep Biddy there, and she was always there, but I had to really focus in and hime in on Byron until I was finished with that character.
That's great. So again, something that people wouldn't know with me saying it, I met you almost a year ago.
Yeah.
and it was just fantastic. I went home and told my wife about how inspired I was by Jared and by you. Jared played Peter Biggs last quarter. And I just remember we told you about what we had planned, and it was kind of harebrained, and it wasn't really baked, and we were just kind of figuring it out. And you were like, yeah, I'll do it.
Yeah, it sounded awesome. I'm all for, I like when voices are heard just in general. I like to think of myself as a social activist in my own life. And so I like when I can learn new things. I didn't know about Biddy before, and it's amazing what I do know now and how much closer I feel to her, especially because she is an African-American woman and I'm an African-American woman, and we already have many connections just with being both African-American.
Right.
And so it was very awesome to kind of allow her voice to come out through me, and so that other people could know her story and know her path and kind of connect that to what's going on with life right now and things like that. And so it was really awesome to like hear the opportunity. And like you said, we didn't know how we were going to do it and like what character I was going to do yet,
Right.
but it was just nice to hear that you guys were very passionate, and to see how passionate you guys were about the work that you were doing. And so that made me more willing and open to being a part of what you were doing.
So getting back to Biddy's story, so the latter half of the 19th century, I'm a huge booster of California, so I had to throw this question in there.
Yay.
But I believe it to be true. I think California was a relatively conducive environment for black entrepreneurs after the Civil War. And I have to underline the word relative. It wasn't a nirvana. There was all kinds of problems. We've already mentioned some of them. There was uncertainty that was astounding. But it was better than some of the other places in our country. So in 1856, Charles marries Biddy's daughter, Ellen. They went on to be a very successful couple in their own right. Charles built upon his father Robert's business in very admirable ways. But I found something interesting that I read that Robert Owens wrote, and I didn't get the date in here, but I'm assuming he wrote it probably in the 1850s, early before the Civil War. And he wrote, and this was in a newspaper, colored men who want to better their condition and enjoy every political right as American citizens should come to the Golden West. And when I read that, it made me feel good as a California entrepreneur, because even back then, people could see California for what it was. We weren't perfect, and we're still not perfect. There's still a lot of issues that we have with race and lack of diversity. But at least even back then, the idea that you could come here and people wouldn't judge you necessarily by your color of your skin. They really would say, "What are you here to do? What are you here to contribute?" And you're allowed to come into this family if you're a contributor. And I noticed he kind of said that in the way he kind of implicitly said that if you come here ready to work, this is a good place for you to come, the West. So it just gave me a little bit of an idea of his mindset. I'd love to hear, because you're much closer to the history, is that consistent with what you think of when you think of Charles and when you think of Robert and the way they built their businesses? Does it surprise you to hear that he would write something like that in a newspaper?
No, it doesn't surprise me, but I think the part that he may have left out that's implied is if you have vision. because his father was able to purchase their freedom in Texas and purchase the entire family and move them to California.
That's Robert's father?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
I didn't understand
that took a certain type of vision
Sure.
to even conceive of wanting to do that.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure most slaves were not happy being slaves, but they didn't really see a way out.
Yeah.
And that was the problem. And they managed to find a way out. So I think that was what he felt, that this was an opportunity. It's interesting because Du Bois wrote something very similar to that in, I think, the 1950s. I can't paraphrase it right now, but it was essentially, he was saying California is a land of opportunity. And that's what fed the Great Migration. But I think a lot of the men, particularly the men that founded the church with Biddy, they all were relatively successful.
Well, and I'm going to ask you in a minute about some of those folks in more specific terms. When I think about this period in history, it's a shame that the migration following the Civil War wasn't more westward and less northern. Nothing wrong with Chicago and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston. Wonderful, better opportunities than the South. But I think it was just too far and too expensive for legions of
they
people.
were industrial hubs too. There were jobs. We
Right.
were still kind of agricultural.
True.
And if you were a slave, why would you want to leave
Right,
one
right.
field and go to another?
I want to pick
you
strawberries
wanna
and
go,
peaches.
exactly.
Yeah.
You want to go someplace where you feel like you can really make a living.
Hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah. Well, let me ask you about Biddy's relationship with Dr. Griffin. So we know from the reenactment or from the soliloquy that Dr. Griffin played a pretty important role in Biddy's life. Again, I'm not super close to the history, but we know that Biddy had some medical training because she had to care for Robert Smith's wife, Rebecca. And apparently she wasn't the healthiest woman on the planet, right? So she was doing that amongst all the other stuff she had to do. Do we know, or to what extent do we know the role that Dr. Griffin played in her medical education? We know that he took her on the rounds with him, but do we know much beyond that?
I think, and I can't prove this, but just from everything that I've read, and I also had the opportunity to go to the Banning Museum in Wilmington. And the curator there, who at the time was Michael Sanborn, explained to me that Biddy and Harriet would come down to Wilmington and stay for months at a time because Banning's wife was sickly also.
Oh, great.
So I think these introductions to these powerful people came through Griffin. And that furthered her renown.
So was Griffin from back east as well?
I think he was from Missouri.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize their association went that far back.
Yeah, I think he was from Missouri.
Okay.
And that was why I think how he remembered, Peter Biggs
From
Missouri.
Peter's time in
Right.
Missouri. Okay. Do we know to what extent Biddy and Peter Biggs had any
I'm
relationship?
curious about that.
Wouldn't that be
I'm
fun to
sure
know?
they knew each
had to.
other. But Biggs seems like, how do I want to describe him in polite company? He seems a bit of a character.
Oh, yeah.
But he made
Master
his way.
of ceremony.
Yeah, he made his way. But I'm sure Biddy knew him because Biddy went to the jails to treat people with smallpox. At that time in downtown Los Angeles, there were a number of brothels. I'm sure she treated the women there.
Sure.
So she was in and out of the Pico house with Pio Pico, and she was probably in and out of the Bella Union as well. So I'm sure she knew.
Which was next door to Peter's salon? Or
Well, his salon was in the Bella Union. Right.
Okay.
So he may have even attended the early church services at some point,
Yep.
But I haven't read anything that validates the fact that they actually knew each other. But given the community at that time, I'm sure they knew each other.
Had to. I mean, as Michelle said, there was 60 people in the census or something that identified as
I'm sure
African
they knew
American.
each other.
I mean,
It would be interesting to kind of research that further and see.
I wonder I would love to get Biddy's off-the-record take of Mr. Biggs.
I'm sure she wouldn't have picked him for a son-in-law. I
No,
don't think.
no.
But
I don't
I'm
think
sure
so.
she knew him.
Yeah, and your point about the church makes sense, that she would have probably wanted to draw him into that church and for a number of reasons. So, Michelle, I have another question for you about your portrayal. I understand that you maybe drew a little bit on your grandmother in trying to find that voice. Have you had a chance to talk to your grandmother about this experience, or?
She's actually passed away
Sorry.
this last year. No, it's okay. But going to her house and knowing and learning about her history, a lot of her and my great grandma, a lot of their family was from Louisiana, and so they have a lot of similarities with how they traveled, how they were treated, and the kind of opportunities that they had. And so it was always fun to sit in the living room with her and kind of just hear her rant on about her life and how it was, and just hear her talk and the way she explained things and the people who she talked about. And so that was kind of the connection that I felt when trying to connect myself to Biddy. I saw a lot of my elders in her, and so it was very interesting to kind of connect it, like the voice and just how her outlook on life, because similarly, my grandma, my great grandma and my great grandpa, they ended up being very successful because they had that kind of Biddy determination, and they pushed through all their obstacles and things like that, because they didn't have a great life. They didn't have many opportunities when they were my age and younger, and even a little bit older. And so it was very cool to kind of draw back to my great grandma and her family and kind of connect her to Biddy.
That's wonderful. I know she'd be proud of you. I know your folks are proud of you.
I hope so.
When they see this performance, I know they're going to be very, very, very proud of you. So I have another question for you, Jackie. So Biddy, as we mentioned, co-founded the First American Methodist Episcopal Church, or FAME, in 1872. It is now the oldest, and is it the largest or one of the? I know it's one of the largest. Churches in Los Angeles to this date.
Yes.
So we're talking about 130 years later, 140 years later. Do you know what her motivation was? I know that she was having church in her home. What was her motivation to start FAME, and what do we know about the other co-founders of the church?
Well, I think her motivation probably was they wanted to have their own church.
So when you say their own church, as distinguished from white churches?
Right.
Or, okay.
Because Biddy actually belonged to Fort Street United Methodist, which was a predominantly white church. But I think the men who were the trustees, Jeremiah Redding, Oscar Smith, John Hall, Robert Owens, John Ballard, and I'm leaving somebody's name off, but I think they probably went to her and said, look, we need to have our own church for our own people. Black churches are peculiarly different from white churches. So. And we address certain issues that we address in black churches that don't get addressed in a predominantly white church. So I think she may have been, I don't want to say coerced, but persuaded, and she probably thought it was a good idea. And that's how they got started.
Do you think they went to her because of her energy, because she could organize people around it?
She could organize it, and she had money. I mean, let's just be real.
Okay.
Although I think it was John Hall who lived next door to Dr. Kurtz, and Dr. Kurtz owned the land for the first church that they bought.
Ah, okay.
And I think Biddy paid for that land and also paid the taxes and paid the minister.
Wow.
Yeah.
So she put them in business.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So you named some of the other co-founders. I'm assuming they were all in their own right successful. And do we know some of the things they were doing?
Lewis Green is particularly interesting to me because he was a barber in the Pico House.
Oh, okay.
And he sued LA City for the right to vote and won.
Wow.
And then after he had won the right to vote, systematically all of the other men did the same. And they were able to start voting.
Each person had to sue?
Well, I don't think they had to sue, but each one was able to vote after that because it was like a landmark case.
Right.
He also took in as an apprentice Hannah's son, Henry, who was the issue.
Remind me, Hannah.
Hannah is the other slave that Biddy was friends with.
Okay.
And she had just had a child at the time of the trial and was not able to to participate.
I remember that, yes.
And that child was the child of Robert Smith.
Oh, great.
And so Lewis Green took him in as an apprentice.
Ah.
So he's particularly interesting to me, his life and why he took the boy in and all of that.
Question for you, Biddy, from one of the students. So the student is asking, Biddy, defied the odds and fought against the status quo. And that was a status quo that was playing for keeps in many cases. I mean, this was serious business, right? You didn't just go up against the status quo without some fear of retribution. This student is wondering, what can we learn from her experience for a millennial today that might feel like they want to go up against the status quo? Like what any inspiration that you have or any words that you think Biddy might have shared with somebody who today, as a 20-year-old, is wondering, how do I tell my parents I don't want to be a doctor? How do I tell my parents I don't want to be an engineer? Whatever their version of going up against the status quo is.
Well, I think that some advice I'd give for people in the future would be to do what you think is right. No matter what obstacles are put in front of you, you know in your heart, and when that feeling you get when you really want to do something that is right, but it's different from everybody else. I think follow that instinct. Always follow that instinct with determination and hard work, and you'll get to where you need to be. You'll pass those obstacles because they're only there to stop you, and fear isn't going to help you. And I think that I got where I got because I made sure that whenever I felt really strongly that what I was about to do was the right thing to do, I didn't stop myself because it was going to be hard.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's easy in life to find reasons to not do something. It's harder in life to dig deep and say, I know this is the right thing. Might be a hard thing, but I'm going to do it anyway. So thank you. I think that is something that we can learn from Biddy's experience.
I wanted to this word millennial gives me trouble. Because I can remember when I was your age, we were thought of as being radical. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was, the bra burning generation.
Right.
I don't think young people should allow Madison Avenue to put labels on you. Don't allow them to define who you are. Mm-hmm. The only difference between what you may be feeling about how you're going to tackle this is technology. You have a phone, you have an iPad, mm-hmm. you can communicate quicker. But basically all what you want is to be recognized and appreciated and to be able to chart your own course.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't allow other people to label you.
Yep.
Because it's misleading.
Yeah.
It's very misleading.
Oh, it's very misleading. It's been going on generation after generation. I think we're sort of an interesting dichotomy where some of the tools make it easier to chart your own path, and in some ways they make it more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because with social media, like, in our day,
mm-hmm.
like people weren't tracking us 24/7.
Right.
Like you could actually go do something and all your friends didn't
You had to
know.
go home to get the message.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, you didn't answer the phone. Where are you? I'm at my house with the phone.
Right.
So in some ways it's made it harder. I think in some ways it's made it easier.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what you said, Biddy, is timeless. It's usually you know what's right in your heart, mm-hmm. and you're just looking for ways to maybe not follow that path because it's not the easiest path, and you're looking for validation from other people so that you can do something that you know isn't the right path. But easier said than done. But I do think that's great advice. Jackie, I have another question about Biddy and her wealth. So we think that in today's terms, her on paper, her wealth was probably $7 to $10 million, something like that. But the land she owned, Spring Street, I mean, this is downtown Los Angeles. For those of you who don't know Los Angeles, we're talking about the Wall Street of LA.
Right.
These are where some of the most expensive Class A business towers exist today. Would be worth billions of dollars. And she started buying her first piece of property, as Michelle showed us, when she was like about 40.
Mm-hmm.
So this
took her 10 years to save enough
save
money
up
to
for
buy
that
it.
one property, right? So she realized that the transfer of wealth across multiple generations was going to be facilitated by owning land. Obviously, Robert Owens was very instrumental in helping her understand that. What I find interesting is today, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but when I read things by social scientists, and they say that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for the black-white wealth gap is this lack of property ownership. And this fact that, whites from, 20s or 30s have been passing homes and properties along, and it hasn't been as prevalent in the black community. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Biddy's children and her grandchildren and what they did with that wealth, but also just in general, just your thoughts on how prescient that was and how unfortunate that it wasn't more widespread, that this philosophy that Biddy and the Owens family were living. It's an ill-formed question, but if you want to talk a little bit about our children and our grandchildren and what they did with that fundamental wealth, and then any other thoughts you have in general about
Well, I think Robert was really the financial mastermind. I mean, he parlayed, he was part of Allensworth and everything else. And I think a lot of the money was lost during the crash, which a lot of people lost money during the crash. But
were they able to hold on to the property, the real estate?
I'm not sure. Interestingly enough, when my daughter was in high school, well, not only high school, but in preschool, she went to school with the great-great-great-great-granddaughters. But I didn't know at the time who they were of Biddy's. Yeah,
Biddy's.
But I didn't know at the time who they were. And then they reconnected in high school, and I used to actually give them a ride home from school every day. And I've since reconnected with Cheryl in particular, and I'm not sure where, what the wealth situation is right now. But I think one of the things that I would say happened in the Black community with wealth, integration. Destroyed a lot of Black businesses. Las Vegas is a classic example. At one time, there was a thriving Black business community in Las Vegas, and when integration opened up, it just fizzled away. And I think that is probably the case for a lot of families. They sold the original property, moved somewhere else, and they didn't keep the original property.
Okay.
So you don't have that land passing down through generations.
Right, that more continuous.
Exactly.
Like the grandfather I was referencing, he never had a lot of money, but he did own a house.
Had land. Yeah.
He did pass whatever he got from that house to my dad, so.
And then as family, with the migration, when people, like in my father's family, my father moved to California, the other brothers stayed in the South. My father didn't really want the land. He saw no point in keeping it, so he sold his portion to one of the other brothers.
Right.
So I think there was a lot of that too.
I wonder if it came in. I'm not an expert here, so I'm really asking a question that I don't know the answer to. But I'm wondering if in the South, because the land was not as valuable. I mean, Malibu. Think about the value of Malibu property versus the value of a farm in Georgia or something.
Right.
And the relative increase is not anywhere close, right? So in the 1800s to now with Malibu, whereas the farm, it's gone up some. Maybe that was part of that mindset. Is land wasn't as it didn't have the appreciation in other parts of the country that it had in California. And Biddy saw that influx of people wanting to buy land.
I think a lot of slaves saw it, to be honest with you. If you were a slave, you saw what happened when the slave owner got in trouble. He either sold land or he sold slaves. So you knew the value of land. So I think, and that probably was a driver for her in terms of this accumulation. And then she was in Los Angeles at a time where it was booming.
But a lot of people didn't buy land. So I live in Santa Barbara,
right?
And people say, "Oh, Santa Barbara, you're so lucky. You've seen the price go up." But you still had to be willing to pay the price at that time,
initially,
which seemed expensive then, right?
Exactly.
So I don't want to take anything away from Biddy, even though the prices have gone up astronomically. $200 was still $200 back then, or $250 was what she paid for the first property. But yeah, obviously it's a very complex dynamic, but with land being one of the aspects of this wealth transference. I'm just astounded that this was something that she saw 100 some years before most people really saw it, or in the Owens as well. Because lots of people came to California, lots of people came to Los Angeles, and they didn't all buy property.
Well, it's like lots of people came to California for the gold rush. How many of them actually made money in the gold
rush?
Levi's. Right.
He did pretty well.
He did very well.
In your words, I mean, I could articulate my reasoning, but I'd love to hear in your words why it's important for us to talk about African American pioneers of the West. What do you see as their contribution, and why should we be doing this?
Well, I think you need to talk about African Americans in history, period. Yeah. I mean, we've been so systematically left out of the history, and this is what I tell my grandkids all the time. They live in New Jersey, and I said, tell me about the man that now his name escapes me, Edison, the man that helped Edison, his assistant. I said, you need to know who that is. Because if you don't, and our work, particularly with foster youth, you have a kid who grows up thrown into the system. He may be in a group home. He or she may or may not know who the father is. Their mother has a drug problem, because that's a common denominator with these kids, is drug abuse of the parents. And if on the TV, all you see is black people in really a very negative light, and you know nothing about your own history, how are you supposed to gain the wherewithal to change or direct your life?
Right.
You have to have role models. So I think if it was just told, if the history was just told accurately, not asking for any special compensation, just tell it accurately.
Right.
And Biddy Mason, Peter Biggs, John Ballard, they were all a part of the founding of Los Angeles.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the foundation and about your work. You mentioned obviously your main mission, which is helping children in foster care. I want to point something out. So I love the tag phrase, which I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but it's "promises are worth keeping." I mean, what an
Promises are for keeping.
Excuse me, are for keeping. What an apt tagline when you're talking about a woman who's made her impact 140 years ago with her promises to her community and how you're carrying those forward. I'd love to hear anything else behind that tagline, and then tell us a little bit about what are some of the specific things you're doing at retail and trying to get the word out, and then obviously how people can help.
Our primary mission is to serve foster care. In Los Angeles County, Los Angeles has the largest population of foster care in the nation. There are 30,000 kids in the system. 30,000 kids in the system. And on average, you have about 3,000 kids emancipating out.
Are they aging out, or
They're
are they getting out?
aging out.
So they're not necessarily finding great.
No, I mean for the ones that we give scholarships, so we have access to kids that are going on to higher education, but the average youth is, depending on what their experience was in the system, if they were lucky enough to stay in one group home with a good foster mother, they may be able to kind of tread water and do well. But we have kids that come to us that have gone to 10 high schools. I mean, how can you have any kind of foundation with that kind of background? So what we do currently is we do events that are specifically designed for foster youth. Next month on April 13th, we have a resource fair where we bring in service providers, colleges, and employers. And when each youth comes to the registration table, they have to get what we call a passport. Each agency is listed there.
Nice.
You have to go to each table, get it stamped, hear the spiel, and move to the next table. When you've completed all of those tables, then you come into the house and you shop for free clothing and free hygiene items. And then we also have a vision board room. And we have this wonderful volunteer, Frances McNeely, that runs the vision board. I think she's in her 80s, but she's like a battery. She doesn't stop. She has the kids singing, and they just love her. And then this year, we're going to have a storytelling workshop.
So I'm ignorant. What's a vision board?
You take a piece of poster board, you cut out pictures from a magazine, and how you want your life to be. Nice. And it's yours.
So it's a way to envision the future in a concrete way.
So we do that. We give scholarships. We always recognize Biddy's birthday on August 15th. And then on Thanksgiving Day, we do a formal sit-down Thanksgiving dinner on Thanksgiving Day because we're trying to teach traditions.
Right. And these kids would...
They don't necessarily get that. The first year we did it potluck because we didn't have any money. And when we were cleaning up and sitting around the table, there was a kid sitting next to me, and he was drawing, because we always do have crafts, because a lot of these kids are very creative, but they never get a chance to explore it. And so I said, "Did you get any clothes?" And he said, "Yes," because we always have clothes. And I said, "Well, where are they?" He said, "They're in the chapel." I said, "Well, you should get your stuff and keep it with you." And he said, "No, I'm okay." So about half an hour later, he was still sitting there, and I said, "Did you ever go back and get your clothes?" He said, "Ma'am, I'm all right. I'm just enjoying listening to you guys talk." And I realized that if he was in, quote, a normal family, this is what would be going on Thanksgiving Day. He would be listening. So then we realized we don't need to be making these, cooking this food. Get somebody else to cook the food. We need to spend the time with the kids. And so that's what we do.
And tell us about the rocking chair.
The rocking chair,
just so you know,
the logo.
So not everybody can see, the logo has a rocking chair, which we were able to bring into the performance.
Well, the rocking chair, the only pictures that we have of Biddy Mason's house show rocking chairs on the front porch. So I remember when I showed that to the pastor, he said, "Jackie, you really want a rocking chair for a logo?" I said, "A lot of these kids need to be rocked." A rocking chair is very comforting. Right.
Yeah,
and in the logo itself, the O in Mason is a wagon wheel. So that symbolizes the trek.
Yeah, makes sense.
And our website is www.biddymason.com.
Definitely.
And I love that you mentioned the rocking chair on the porch. What I've heard anecdotally was, it was said that it was not uncommon for people to be sitting on that porch eating a meal that she gave them.
Right.
So it's one thing to write a check and sort of
Yeah.
like, don't bother me, like, which is fine, write checks, we want your checks. But you know what I mean, it's one thing to not really get your hands dirty, but just sort of help them by monetary standards. But I think it's another thing to cook somebody a meal, a stranger,
Right.
Yeah.
and just say, you know what, just have a seat and I'll bring you out some food.
Because the day she died, the stories I've heard is that there were people lined up for help. The day she died, and they actually had to turn them
really?
away because she had passed on.
Wow.
But that whole thing of sharing food together and talking, I mean, can you imagine how many people she counseled in the
Yeah.
process of treating them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, to your point about a therapist.
Yeah, and I also think she would have been even bigger. I definitely think she would have still been doing her community work, and she would have possibly been doing something similar to what Jackie is doing, like having a foundation and an organization that is larger than just herself,
Right.
where she has a group of people helping her as well that have the same idea and care for people that she does, that she can help on a larger level.
Well, you could argue with the AME Church.
Yeah.
She did that, right?
Yeah,
So
well,
was
she
able-
started an orphanage and a school, which is the reason, because we're only taking one portion of her philanthropy, foster care.
Yeah.
There's that whole other stuff
Well, tell
out
me,
there.
because I that was one of my potential questions. Tell me about that a little bit. What other things did she do besides?
Well, she started a school for black children.
Okay.
She helped so many people. It's impossible to know how many people she really helped, given the locale of where she was located, and people knew that they could come to her for help. She helped First AME all through those infancy years.
Well, it truly is an honor for you to come up here, and I know it wasn't, you had to take a lot of time out of your day and to make it work. And we really,
The
really
train
appreciate
ride
it.
is worth it.
The train ride. Hopefully, you got some good ocean views. The train ride between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara is
It's very
not too
nice.
bad, but
Very, very
it still
nice.
takes a commitment of time, and we really appreciate that. I'll wear the button with pride. I appreciate you giving that to me. And Michelle, again, just thank you for being a yes and being so positive, and you brought such energy to this performance and all the work you did with the students that we didn't capture on camera, but just the questions you fielded, that they fielded, that you fielded from them, excuse me.
Yeah.
I know they were inspired by that. There was a lot of really positive feedback after the performance.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a great opportunity for me to learn something new, and also just another challenge that was opened up to me as an actress, and then also just as a person to do something that was different, and to open up the opportunity for another voice to be heard, another
Agreed.
story to be told, and
Right.
that was awesome.
Yeah, if a handful of people Google Biddy and start reading about her, and then these other people that were also, important people in their own right, then we've done our job.
Right.
Yeah.
And plus, I can tell people I knew you back when.
Yeah, hopefully.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.